Welcome to Daily Grace. We're so glad you've joined us today for a little bit of grace in the middle of the day. Let me ask you a question. What would it be like to leave home and everything you know and go across the world for the sake of the gospel and live in another place? And then what would it be like to be locked down in your apartment in that place across the world where the only reason you're there is to share the gospel of Jesus Christ? What is it like to be a missionary in these days of COVID? Well, I've got a good friend with us, a good friend to many of us here at Grace, Kirk Ogden, the Executive Director of South America Mission. Welcome, Kirk.
Hi, Jason. Great to be here.
We're so glad you're here. Kirk has been in town for a couple of days as he and I have been sort of strategizing. I serve on the board, as you know, of SAM, and we've had a great couple of days. But I wanted to ask some of these types of questions of you for the sake of the global Christians here at Grace in Eastern North Carolina.
Great.
So what is it like? No, before we get to that one. Tell us a little, remind us again about South America Mission.
Yeah.
So where is it based? Where do we work?
Yeah. Well, South America Mission is based out of this now Charlotte area. So not too far from here. It took me 4 hours to get here.
That's right.
We've been there for the last number of years.
I can do it in 3.5. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, they're good. Yeah. We're about 105 years old. So we originally were up in New York because back then when you left for foreign lands, you got on a boat, and the Port of New York was the place to go. Later, we were in Florida, South America Mission. That was the best jumping off point to get to Latin America. Recently, we've come back to the Carolinas just because of the depth of relationship we have with churches and from Christians in this country who participate in God's work. So about 105 years old and not too far from here over in Charlotte.
Yeah. Now, where are the places that Sam is working in Latin America?
Yeah, well, we think about our context as all of Latin America. And so when you think about ministry impact, we really don't want to limit it to specific countries. We want to have the mentality that God's called us to that area. But specifically, we have historic work in people in Bolivia, Brazil, Peru, Colombia. Paraguay is a historic ministry area. We don't have anybody there right now. But also have been recently exploring partnerships in Argentina, looking at Trinidad and Tobago through TEAM, or another partner mission organization, Mexico and Guatemala, even Nicaragua. So God's opening up all kinds of doors.
Fantastic. And how big is this SAM family?
Yeah, we have probably around 120 missionaries when you add in team folks. We're talking more like 150, 160 missionaries together. So, and that's mainly missionary sent personnel as opposed to the folks who are working alongside of us in local places.
Right, so there's even more partners locally.
Absolutely. Some of our most exciting ministries probably have a 10% population of missionary personnel. You've been to AMI. It's a Bible training center for native populations in Brazil, and most of the staff there are believers, leaders who have come up from native peoples and are now leading and teaching. And there's a few missionary staff there as well, but it's a great partnership.
That is a great partnership. That was one of the best parts of seeing the work of God in Brazil a couple of years ago. Okay, so let's ask that question right from the beginning of, well, what is it like? What has it been like since March?
Yeah.
For folks who've left Kinston, North Carolina to go and live in a place like Bolivia, Santa Cruz.
Well, I think one of the things, to answer that question, I want to start with what do we think about with missions in general? And we think about the Apostle Paul as a missionary. I think the real model is Jesus. At the beginning of John, when it says Jesus moved into the neighborhood, as Eugene Peterson says, and dwelled among us. He tabernacled with us. That idea of incarnation, there's a leaving, a sentness, and a presence that is really part of missionary work that we try to replicate all the time. So when you're crazy enough to leave a comfortable place like Kinston and go to a place that you don't know, where you look different, where you don't know the culture, it very much is with an idea that part of God's work is you being the presence there. Now, in much of Latin America, the quarantines and the pandemic have looked even different than they have here. So we've seen restaurants closed or limited and things like that, but the idea of the stay-at-home orders have been much stricter in much of Latin America. And so in some countries, for example, you could only leave your house 1 day a week between certain hours, and it was based on your ID number that you had. That's a lot different from maintaining social distance and wearing a mask. But that also really strikes at the heart of what it means to be incarnationally present with people. And so I've really been praying for our missionaries recently because of that struggle of what does it look like to have gone all the way, but to be stuck in a place that's a little different than what we're experiencing here.
And what are you hearing from them? Like, how are they wrestling with that?
Yeah,
Because different ones are, temperament affects how you wrestle.
yeah. Well, I think one of the questions is, why am I even here? And I think one of the things we've been trying to deal with our missionaries is help them understand that being present in quarantine is a part of witness, because they're present with other people who are also experiencing the same thing. So where they do have relationships, they still have the phone calls. They're doing the same kind of gatherings online that we are, but they're doing it from an experience that's shared with the people that they're ministering to. So there's been those joys. There have also been opportunities to open up new doors where we've been able to work with local churches to get permission to do something, to get food supplies to poorer neighborhoods. And you have to get a special permission,
Right.
but there's a door for the gospel that would not have normally been open because of the need that's being presented.
Which, interestingly, we're finding that too. People are isolated, lonely, scared. That's a door for every one of those is a doorway for us to share our faith in our own context.
Absolutely.
How much more so, someone in Lima and a neighbor saying, "Well, now why did you leave California to move to Lima?"
Yeah, absolutely.
And-
And I imagine you here at Grace, while there's been a lot of hardship, you've had your meetings interrupted, you're restarting, you're having a reduced presence. There have probably also been new things that have been accomplished that the Lord has done because of this period. And so we're trying to figure out how do we help our missionary team and our partner churches step into that so that this doesn't just become a limit to the gospel, but an opportunity for the gospel.
That's true. And one of those things for us is the daily grace.
Mm.
We never would have thought of doing that before, but then trying to connect people together when we were
Absolutely.
on more homebound stuff.
Absolutely.
But then it just morphed into a couple times a week. But anyway.
Yeah, we have one missionary in Peru who is pastoring a church plant that was just getting going. They couldn't meet. It's still illegal for churches to meet on weekends there in Peru. And a lot of his fellow pastor friends were getting excited about the idea that, wow, people are going to tune into my preaching. I'm reaching more people.
Yes.
And this particular missionary, who happens to be Peruvian himself, realized that, you know what, now people can go to whoever they want. What has God equipped me to do, and how has he made me that's unique? And he started doing something similar to Daily Grace, but he's actually a former motorcycle champion. So he did daily podcasts talking about motorcycles and spirituality.
Wow.
And people from all across the faith spectrum would come and have that conversation. So it's a great example of how to use the pandemic.
That's fantastic. So as us here in Eastern North Carolina and at Grace, as we want to be involved with our missionaries that are, through Asia, through Europe, through Latin America, and so forth, what would you say as someone who's running a mission organization is the best thing that a church and Christians here can do to support folks in this time?
Well, I do think that the idea of how to pray for missionaries during this time, we always think about how to pray for missionaries, but in this time, that idea of perseverance and being able to walk through the particular ideas of isolation. For folks here who are living internationally, they can't get back sometimes. It's very hard to travel. They have family dealing with particular struggles here. So praying for those, finding ways to support the network of their family back here in the U.S. If they have older parents, how does supporting churches minister to the community that they can't be present to is another way. Thinking through opportunities for education for kids. We're dealing with school issues here. It's even more serious in Latin America and all over the world in terms of access to education. So what kind of resources can we get behind missionaries and support? We've tried to do things and try and enhance technological abilities to open those doors. And thankfully, we've had a generous response. And so we've been able to get back with some tangible things and report back on that. So giving and specifically to response, praying for the missionaries, in particular their perseverance in this time, and then thinking through what are the things that they can't be part of here, especially during this time, because and trying to figure out ways to step into those things.
That's great. And it feels like, even just emailing and being more in their lives to know what's going on with their parents back here. But, for each of us. And a lot of our house churches have adopted a different missionaries or are thinking about that. And that is a great way, as members of different families can adopt and love a missionary overseas through email and FaceTime and Facebook and stuff. Facebook and Instagram and social media is such a little bit separate from where we were before. It's fascinating because we can keep up with people, but we're not necessarily as intimate with people because you've come across my feed, so I think I'm up to date with you, but I really don't know what's going on in your heart. Whereas a phone call
Yeah.
maybe takes me farther.
Yeah, and you've seen in the business world the increase of virtual communication. So folks are doing those kind of things, and they're ready for that kind of conversation. There are other just tangible things. College kids, missionary kids go to college, sometimes here in the U.S. So when colleges got sent home last year, we had missionary kids who weren't able to get back to their parents. They couldn't stay in their dorms.
Yeah.
And so we were able to have 2 college girls move in with us. We have one ourselves. And so those kind of relationships, when churches have those kind of relationships with their missionaries and are able to have the communication to anticipate those needs, that's a great help to missionaries.
That's fantastic. Sam, South America Mission, what's next? I mean, we're in this suspension here in COVID and as things change, but really, like, as you're looking 6 months and then 6 years,
Yeah.
what's coming? What do
Yeah.
you see coming?
Well, in general, I think that's one of the real challenges. I love to think and dream and plan. I want to understand my context to do that well. In a season like this, it feels like so much work to understand the context. How do I make plans for a future that is even harder to discern than it used to be?
Yeah.
So one of the things right now is, the next 6 months is just a season of asking the Lord, show us, and waiting. Now, fortunately, we've been doing that. And when we turned 100 years old, we said, okay, Lord, what's next? What's our next century? And so we've cultivated a little bit of a habit in that. So we're dreaming now and looking at the context, but it continues to say, in Latin America in particular, a growth in urbanization. That's a big deal. Continued transformation of society with youth kind of coming up, and how do we minister well and equip churches to minister well? And then thinking through as the church grows and those folks live out their faith, not just in a spiritual context, but also in the workplace.
Yeah.
How do we help equip the church, new believers, to tear down the secular sacred divide? So those are 3 things in particular: city, youth movement, and continued focus on thinking through what it looks like to be a Christian in the workplace, so that the whole society is changed.
Yeah, sort of that discipleship and worldview and leading people into just living their faith as opposed to a saved soul.
Absolutely.
That's we have thought for 100 years, 105 years. In fact, 5 years ago this month we were celebrating
Yeah.
100 years, which was fantastic. The whole Kirk made the decision, and everybody rallied around to bring the whole missionary family together to Panama, because it would be the closest for those as well as folks for the U.S. And we had a great week in Panama together. It was rich.
Yeah. And part of the richness was we brought existing missionaries. We brought retirees.
Yeah.
We brought board members. We brought some partner churches, some sending churches. We also brought a lot of those folks we've been working with for so many years. So some of the most beautiful voices were those who we've been ministering to and alongside and with there, and just seeing that richness and hearing together what the Lord had. So we're enjoying that process in an ongoing way.
It's true. And what I was going to say is that we have been thinking, or maybe our default thought when we think of missions or missionaries, is folks from the U.S., Canada, Europe, leaving home to go overseas. And that's still part of God's calling, because mobilizing the church. But increasingly, we're also seeing folks from Brazil going to another country, a believer from Brazil going as a missionary, a believer from Peru going to Colombia, a believer from Colombia going to Europe. I mean, talk to us about how we as SAM are helping enculturate that or engender that.
Well, I think it reflects a little bit of Grace's idea here. When you're thinking about launching church planting ministry, group producing church plants, that's the same kind of thing. If we're doing gospel ministry, yes, we want to see people come to Christ, but what does that obedience to Christ look like? It means them also participating in God's kingdom work. And so sometimes in the past, perhaps we've not done as good a job of kind of taking on to the next steps. But there are some great ministries now that are advocacy for God's global work and seeing all his people from all over the world participate in the Great Commission to go and make disciples of all nations. So that's one of the joys for us, and I think that's going to be, it already is happening in the Latin American church, and it's going to continue to happen. Interestingly, the pandemic has slowed global movement tremendously.
Yeah.
So what does it look like?
Like you don't want stock in airlines right now.
That's right. And it's hard to get back and forth. Even from this country, there are a lot of countries that won't let us get back.
I can't go see my mom.
That's right, and without quarantining. So it is an interesting season to talk about God's work, but having to wait on the Lord to see what that could be play out and what the future looks like, we don't know.
Yeah. Ask the Lord. One of the things every summer here in Kinston, ETL, Erasing the Lines, and a multi-church mission trip in town. And they do service projects all week. They stay at camp. One morning or one afternoon, as they do different service projects, is always ATL. And all it is that your group just simply asks the Lord, what do you want us to do today? And it is an exercise in teaching these kids how to discern by faith how God is leading them. And you're just in this massive ATL zone.
Absolutely. You know, one of the things I've been reflecting on recently is kind of that missionary posture of waiting. On one level, you don't become a missionary without an idea of what God's called you to. But sometimes the process of identifying that idea and getting there is a long journey. I've been reading the David Livingstone biography with my son. David Livingstone was a Scottish missionary to Africa and a pioneering missionary, and was very passionate about it. He got on a boat in England, and on the way the mast broke, and they ended up drifting all the way to Brazil, and where they had to get the boat repaired. So his little journey to Africa turned into this massive journey and adventure to get to there. And his first ministry was actually missionary ministry was actually in South America. But that idea, and we've been talking about that, especially with some of our new missionaries who are preparing to go. You know, they've sensed the call, they've begun the process. Some of them have left jobs, they're raising support, and they can't even get a plane ticket to leave the country because of that. So that posture of waiting and asking the Lord, why, is so central, and we're being reminded of that. But it's part of the missionary journey all the way along.
And the Christian journey.
And the Christian
journey,
absolutely.
None of us wants to wait, and we're not good at it. And man, I can't make an airline take me to Peru as a missionary, but man, I can manufacture things here in my own life to sort of end run the waiting that God wants me to do for this, that, or the next thing.
Yeah.
That's a hard one. You want to come back and preach on that for us?
Yeah. Well, even the other thing that I think is challenging for me right now, in remembering the distinction, as missionaries, when we go to another place, we are so sent, we stand out, it's so clear. And I think sometimes, even in our home culture, it's hard, our effort is more to fit in. It's then to say, how do we not stand out so that we earn the opportunity? And in these trying times, you know, figuring out how does the world recognize us as different in our home culture? And asking the Lord, what does he have for us today? How am I supposed to be different, even as I wait on those purposes? That's a big challenge for local believers, and it's increasingly a challenge for missionaries as well.
Where are you most excited about what God's doing? Like, that's a small question.
Yeah. You know, one of the things that is central to my heart is the idea of how we work together in ministry, and especially around the concept of kingdom. So it's so easy for us to try and define projects. Kingdom of God is so much bigger than projects. So I'm excited about the movement in Christian ministries, especially as our projects are brought low by a pandemic, to think about what are God's kingdom purposes in this, and the way we're able to erase some of the lines between organizations, between what I know, what you know, and moving together. So in Christian mission in general, that's one of my central passions, is how do we have generous collaboration, that the way we work together is countercultural to everything we know, so that Christ is proclaimed in that. And as I see us do that well, I see a church growing up around the world that will be part of making disciples of all nations.
What I love about Sam, and what I think Grace leans into as well, and when I came to this church, it leaned into it, the elders, the body here, but I love it about Sam, is that the end never justifies the means. Process is as important as outcome, and all of it has to be for Christ's glory.
Absolutely.
And that's what I think, you know, that's what you and what the leadership team and the board at SAM are trying to make sure we don't miss, because there's so many opportunities to cut corners and then undercut the very gospel we're proclaiming.
Absolutely. And Jason, you know that I've been looking at the end of Acts and Paul's life at the end of, and just was reviewing the verses a few minutes ago. And Paul, at the end of his life, we never hear about the end of his life. We just hear those last days, because that's what's important. And he's in prison and he can't go anywhere. He has restrictions. He's quarantined. And the Bible is boldly, it says this, it says he's preached the gospel in the kingdom of heaven boldly and without hindrance. And how it can be said that he's preaching without hindrance when he's locked on house arrest it makes you rethink. And I think it makes the church here rethink, and it makes our missionaries rethink. How do we participate in that even today?
Man, and even we can be part of removing hindrances for the gospel, like boldly and without hindrance. If someone's going out boldly, we can help remove the obstacle
Yeah,
as
absolutely.
a sending church.
And-
That's great. I like that.
And I'm grateful for the way Grace is doing that, and excited for what you're doing here locally, too.
Okay, so let me ask you this question. You do a lot of, well, not since March, but before then, you are in a lot of countries all the time. You grew up, first 13 years of your life on the mission field in Peru, but mostly in Colombia. So you have an extensive international outlook. A lot of us here, especially in Eastern North Carolina, we maybe don't get around the world as much, and we maybe don't hear Christians from around the world reflecting back on America. What are Christians, our brothers and sisters, saying about America right now, especially in our silly season, which is what we call the presidential election, which I only say because everybody goes a little bit crazy and we all lose a little perspective. What can we learn from our brothers and sisters around the world? I'm probably putting you on the spot, aren't I?
Yeah, that's a tricky question, because I think the church globally does not have the same perspective on our political situation as many in the church here.
Huh.
And I've always wondered, what is the difference? Some of it is the church has a different makeup in a little bit, and so
That's true.
issues of survival in much of the world are part of the church's daily life. And so thinking through issues of justice and dignity are a big part. And so as the church looks back, they get a little confused sometimes at how our politics here seem to align, and the church seems to sometimes align itself with a political party. And they question whether we're not making a political figure king sometimes instead of Jesus. So that's a challenge for our missionaries too.
Right.
Because when we show up, many of us, not all of us in South America Mission, but many of us are from the United States. When we show up in a different place, it's hard to not carry that baggage and to not be interpreted through that light. So we got to be very careful with our message. But that's one thing, is to look at life from the light of the gospel, not from the light of a political agenda. I think would be something that our brothers around the world would urge for us.
Well, we got right into business, but tell us a little bit about your family. So you live in the Charlotte area, just over the border in South Carolina.
That's right.
And yeah.
Yeah, we're in Fort Mill, South Carolina, which is where Sam's offices are technically. And we have 4 children, and we have one in each stage of, we have one in college, one in high school, one in middle school, and one in elementary school.
Wow.
And so we have kind of the educational thing, have been experiencing that whole variety. Our daughter's back at college, and so far it's going well. Our kids are back in school on AB days, but
Right.
It's happening.
Which of the 3 are going to go full-time first? Did you say the youngest?
The youngest in elementary school will go full-time in just a few weeks. And the college student is back full-time where she is in Virginia. So it's been a great season for us. I have been home because normally I'm traveling a lot.
Yes.
And so it's been a different dynamic. In fact, even I've now had trips 2 weekends in a row, or 2 weeks in a row, and the kids kind of said, "Dad's leaving again. What's going on?" But it's been a sweet season in that, and beginning to look and say, how do we invest locally in the community? It's always been on my heart, but it's hard when you're trying to travel globally. But they're thriving. God is good.
And I'm amazed. You told me yesterday that you actually are getting your family up and going for a run in the morning.
Well, that's mostly my need, but yeah, one of the ways I try to engage my kids and our community is trying to coach some local youth sports. It's one of those doors, I think, that we have both to serve the community, but also just have relationships. And so trying to stay fit for that has been important, and it's been good for me. So we've used pandemic to put a few miles on some running shoes.
I think that's fantastic. Well, we thank you for coming on the Daily Grace and encouraging us today. And of course, it has been so fun for you and me to do some SAM work for these last couple of days. Just a joy. And always you have to thank Emily for letting you come, because we love Emily, and maybe one day you'll bring the whole family back. But Kirk, thank you so much.
It's great to be here with you and with Grace.
It's a joy to partner together. And thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time on Daily Grace.